Elena sat by the window of her small cottage, staring out into the empty village road as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her heart felt as heavy as the dark clouds gathering above. She had come to this remote village with her husband, Victor, who had promised her a new life, a fresh start away from the chaos of the city. But soon after their son, Leo, was born, Victor vanished without a trace, leaving Elena alone and devastated. With no money, no family, and no one to turn to, Elena was left in a place where no one knew her. She was alone, raising a child with nothing but her will to survive. She had no idea how she would make it through the coming days, but one thing was certain: she would not give up. Leo was her world, her reason for pushing forward. She couldn't afford to collapse, not when her son needed her the most. In the beginning, every day felt like a battle for survival. With no income, Elena was forced to take on any job she could find, from cleaning houses to working in the fields. The villagers, though initially distant, soon noticed the young mother's relentless spirit and began offering small acts of kindness. Mrs. Agatha, an elderly woman who lived nearby, would bring over baskets of fresh vegetables from her garden, and Mr. Tomas, a local farmer, occasionally dropped off firewood and helped repair the worn-out roof of her cottage. Still, it wasn't enough to ease Elena's fears. The long nights, the cold, and the overwhelming loneliness threatened to swallow her whole. But every time she looked into Leo's bright, innocent eyes, she found the strength to keep going. She had no choice. She had to survive, not just for herself, but for him. As weeks turned into months, the kindness of the villagers became a lifeline for Elena. Mrs. Agatha's regular visits became more frequent, and soon she was staying for tea, offering words of encouragement and listening to Elena's worries. Though Elena had always been a private person, she found comfort in Mrs. Agatha's warm presence. She shared little by little about her past, about Victor's abandonment, and her fear of the future. "You're a strong girl," Mrs. Agatha said one afternoon, patting Elena's hand. "You've already come this far. You've survived what many wouldn't. Don't you worry, dear. You're not alone anymore." It was true. The villagers had come together, not out of pity, but out of genuine respect for Elena's strength and determination. Mr. Tomas, a man of few words, would silently drop off supplies at her doorstep, always with a nod of understanding. Even the local grocer, who had once seemed indifferent, began offering Elena small discounts on food, knowing how hard she was working to provide for her son. Despite their help, Elena still felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Leo, now a toddler, was frequently sick. The cold, damp air in the village seemed to affect his fragile lungs, and Elena spent many sleepless nights by his bedside, watching over him as he coughed through the night. One particularly cold winter night, Leo's fever spiked to a dangerous level. His small body trembled, and Elena's heart raced with fear. She had tried everything she knew, cold compresses, herbal remedies from Mrs. Agatha, but nothing seemed to bring down the fever. Desperation clawed at her as she realized she needed real medical help. But the nearest doctor, Dr. David, was miles away in the neighboring town. Without hesitating, Elena bundled Leo in blankets and set out into the night, walking the long, icy road to Dr. David's clinic. The wind bit at her cheeks, and the snow-covered ground made every step feel like a struggle, but she refused to stop. Her legs burned, and her arms ached from carrying Leo, but she couldn't let him suffer any longer. By the time she reached the clinic, her feet were numb, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Dr. David, hearing the frantic knock at his door, opened it to find Elena, pale and trembling, holding her feverish child. "Please," Elena gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help him." Dr. David quickly took Leo into his arms and let Elena inside. His clinic was warm, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside, and Elena immediately felt a sense of relief wash over her as she followed him into the small examination room. Dr. David worked swiftly, his hands gentle but sure as he examined Leo and began administering medicine to reduce the fever. As he worked, he glanced at Elena, noting the exhaustion etched into her features. Her eyes were red and swollen from lack of sleep, her clothes worn and patched from years of hard work. She was clearly a woman who had endured more than her share of hardship. "You've done everything you can for him," Dr. David said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "He's going to be all right now." Elena nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She had been strong for so long, but in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the clinic and the kindness of Dr. David, the weight of her struggles threatened to overwhelm her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined not to fall apart in front of the doctor. But Dr. David, sensing her pain, offered her a chair and sat down beside her. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he asked gently. Elena hesitated, unsure if she should open up to a man she barely knew. But something in Dr. David's eyes, a kindness, a genuine concern, made her feel safe, and before she knew it, the words were spilling out. She told him about Victor's abandonment, about the hardships of raising Leo alone, and about the fear that constantly gnawed at her. Dr. David listened quietly, his heart aching for the woman sitting before him. He had seen many patients over the years, but there was something about Elena's story, her strength, and her determination that touched him deeply. "You've done more than most would in your situation," he said softly. "You're stronger than you realize." From that night on, Elena and Leo visited Dr. David regularly, not just for medical help, but for the companionship that seemed to blossom between them. Dr. David, though reserved by nature, found himself drawn to Elena's quiet strength and the deep love she had for her son. He admired her resilience, the way she never complained about her circumstances, and how she always put Leo's needs before her own. Elena, too, found herself looking forward to their visits. There was something comforting about being in Dr. David's presence. He was kind, patient, and always knew how to ease her worries, whether through his medical expertise or simply by offering her a cup of tea and listening to her talk about her day. Over time, their conversations grew longer, and the bond between them deepened. Dr. David began visiting Elena and Leo at their cottage, bringing small gifts for Leo and helping with chores around the house. He never asked for anything in return, and his visits became a source of comfort for Elena, who had grown so accustomed to fending for herself. The villagers, too, noticed the growing friendship between the young mother and the town's doctor. Mrs. Agatha would often smile knowingly when she saw Dr. David heading toward Elena's cottage, while Mr. Tomas would give a nod of approval whenever he passed by the doctor on the road. Though neither Elena nor Dr. David spoke of their feelings, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a connection that went beyond words, rooted in respect, admiration, and perhaps something more. As the winter months gave way to spring, the bond between Elena and Dr. David continued to grow, and though neither of them dared to say it aloud, both knew that their friendship was slowly blossoming into something much deeper, a love neither had expected to find. Spring brought new life to the village, with flowers blooming and the air filled with the scent of fresh earth. For Elena, it was as if the season mirrored her own heart, which had begun to thaw after years of emotional isolation. Leo had grown stronger, thanks to Dr. David's care, and the once sickly boy was now a healthy, playful child. Elena watched him run through the fields, his laughter filling the air, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. But there was more to her newfound happiness than just her son's health. Dr. David's frequent visits had become the highlight of her days. His presence brought warmth into her home, and Elena found herself looking forward to their conversations, the shared cups of tea, and the quiet moments they spent together after Leo had gone to bed. Dr. David would often stay late, talking to Elena about his life as a doctor, the struggles and joys of his work, and listening to her recount stories of her past. He had become more than just a friend. He had become someone she relied on, someone who had filled the void Victor had left behind. One evening, after another of Dr. David's visits, Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at the empty cup he had left behind. A realization washed over her. She was in love. It wasn't the same kind of love she had felt for Victor, which had been built on promises that were never kept. This was different. It was quiet, steady, and built on trust and mutual respect. Dr. David had shown her what it meant to be truly cared for. And for the first time in years, Elena allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't alone. But doubt lingered in her mind. What if he didn't feel the same? What if this was just friendship for him? She didn't want to jeopardize the bond they had built. But the thought of never telling him how she felt weighed heavily on her. One late afternoon, as Elena and Leo were playing outside, Dr. David arrived unexpectedly at the cottage. He looked different, more serious, as if something had been weighing on him. Elena greeted him with a warm smile, but her heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. She could sense that something was on his mind. "Can we talk, Elena?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded, her stomach fluttering with nerves. After sending Leo inside to play, they sat together on the porch, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, and Elena could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Dr. David took a deep breath before speaking. "I've been wanting to tell you something for a while now," he began, his eyes searching hers. "When I first met you and Leo, I was just doing my job. I wanted to help, to make sure your son was healthy. But over time, I've come to care for you both more than I ever expected. You've been through so much, and you've handled it with such grace and strength. I admire you, Elena. More than that, I love you." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had imagined this moment so many times, but hearing the words from Dr. David's lips filled her with a joy she hadn't thought possible. Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached out to take his hand. "I love you too, David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never thought I would feel this way again, but you've brought so much light into my life. You've been there for me when no one else was, and I can't imagine my life without you." Dr. David smiled, relief washing over him. He gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, a kiss that was tender and full of the promises they had both been afraid to make before. In that moment, all the pain of Elena's past seemed to melt away, replaced by the warmth of the love they had found in each other. News of Elena and Dr. David's budding romance spread quickly through the village. But instead of judgment, the villagers were overjoyed. Mrs. Agatha, who had been one of Elena's biggest supporters, was particularly thrilled. "I knew it," she said with a knowing smile one day when she came by to visit. "The way he looked at you, Elena, you two were meant to be together." Elena blushed, grateful for the acceptance and kindness she had found in the village. Her life had changed so drastically over the past few months, and now, with Dr. David by her side, she felt a sense of hope and happiness she hadn't known in years. Leo, too, had taken a liking to Dr. David. He would often run to him whenever he arrived at the cottage, eager to show him his latest drawings or tell him about his day. Dr. David had become a father figure to Leo, and the bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, as they all sat together after dinner, Leo climbed onto Dr. David's lap and looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Are you going to be my daddy now?" he asked, his voice filled with the pure curiosity of a child. Dr. David's heart swelled with emotion. He had grown to love Leo as if he were his own son, and the thought of becoming a true father to him filled him with a sense of purpose and joy. He looked at Elena, who smiled softly, her eyes brimming with love. "If you'll have me, Leo," Dr. David said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored to be your daddy." Leo beamed and threw his arms around Dr. David's neck. "I want you to be my daddy," he whispered. Tears filled Elena's eyes as she watched the two of them. It was everything she had ever hoped for. Her son was loved, cared for, and happy. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she had a family again. As the months passed, Elena and Dr. David's relationship deepened. They spent more time together, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Dr. David had become a permanent fixture in Elena and Leo's lives, and the love they shared had brought a sense of peace and stability to the small family. One warm summer evening, Dr. David invited Elena and Leo to a picnic on the hill overlooking the village. It was a special spot they had often visited together, a place where they could escape the world and simply enjoy each other's company. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the landscape, Dr. David turned to Elena, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had been planning this moment for weeks, and now, with the beauty of the evening as the perfect backdrop, he was ready. "Elena," he began, taking her hand in his, "you've brought so much joy into my life. You and Leo have given me a family I never knew I wanted, but now I can't imagine my life without you both. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Elena's heart raced as she watched Dr. David pull a small velvet box from his pocket and open it to reveal a beautiful ring. Tears filled her eyes as he got down on one knee. "Elena," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, "will you marry me?" For a moment, Elena was speechless. She had never imagined that her life would take this turn, that after all the pain and heartbreak, she would find love again. But here she was, with a man who loved her and her son unconditionally, offering her a future she had once thought impossible. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dr. David stood and slipped the ring on her finger before pulling her into his arms. They kissed as the sun dipped below the horizon, and Leo, watching with wide eyes, clapped his hands in excitement. "We're going to be a family," Leo said with a grin, and both Elena and Dr. David laughed, their hearts full of joy. Elena and Dr. David were married in a small, intimate ceremony in the village church. The entire village turned out to celebrate, and Elena couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the love and support she had received from the people who had once been strangers. Mrs. Agatha, Mr. Tomas, and all the others who had helped her through her darkest times were there, smiling and cheering as she walked down the aisle toward the man who had captured her heart. Leo, dressed in a tiny suit, stood proudly beside Dr. David, holding the rings. He beamed up at his mother, his eyes filled with happiness. As Elena and Dr. David exchanged vows, promising to love and support each other for the rest of their lives, Elena felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had been through so much, but now, standing here with the man she loved and her son by her side, she knew that all the hardships had led her to this moment. In the end, Elena's story was one of survival, strength, and the unexpected beauty of second chances. Through the kindness of strangers, the love of a good man, and the unwavering bond of family, she found happiness beyond her wildest dreams. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.